reign of Queen Victoria saw the birth of the modern world. In Britain, in the first half of the 19th century, a force was unleashed that would topple dynasties and change the life of almost every human on the planet. Steam was the genie of the modern age, and it was the British who let it out of the bottle. It would make their small island the workshop of the world. They would build railways and steamships to span the globe, and they would forge the weapons to rule it. But as they sent their explorers and armies to the far corners of the earth, they would face a greater challenge than impassable rapids and hostile natives. That challenge was whether to use their power for good or for evil, to improve the world or to merely subjugate it. The struggle over how to use their power would divide the most famous names of the Victorian age. Missionaries like David Livingstone, engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, warrior heroes like Gordon of Khartoum, writers like Charles Dickens, and statesmen like William Ewart Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. And it would confront Victoria herself with a revolution, industrial, social, and finally political, a revolution that threatened her heritage, her throne, and her life itself. In 1819, the year Victoria was born, the world was closer to that of the Greeks and Romans than to the world of today. Most people lived and worked on the land. They had few machines, and those they did have were powered by wind or water, or more commonly, by a horse. The great shire horses of Old England cleared the land, plowed the fields, and hauled their produce to market. Horsepower established the limit of speed, and the fastest means of public transport was the horse-drawn coach. Those heavy stage coaches swayed and jolted along the highways of Britain at no more than 10 miles per hour. In the 1830s, they were much used by a young journalist, Charles Dickens, who compared the experience to being broken alive on the torturer's wheel. No form of punishment, he wrote, could be more effective. But all that was about to change. Britain had pioneered the age of steam. The first steam locomotives heralded a revolution that would give Britain a decisive lead over her trading rivals, but shake its social and political stability to the core. By 1829, the world's first public railroad was completed, linking the cities of Liverpool and Manchester. George Stephenson's steam engines rushed along the iron tracks at an astonishing 35 miles an hour. But the opening ceremony was marred by a regrettable incident. A leading member of the government was knocked down by Stephenson's fastest locomotive, the Rocket, and he was crushed to death. The modern world had arrived. Giant machines driven by steam were changing a way of life that had endured for centuries. But there was a dark side to this vision of power and progress that was obscured by the promise of rich rewards.
The British at that time were masters not only of industrial production, but of the means of distributing the things they made around the world. They were really on top of the world, and it gave them, I'm sure, a kind of magical feeling, a feeling as if they'd acquired the Promethean fire. You know, they were doing things that nobody else could do, and they could do it. They could do anything.
In Greek mythology, Prometheus brought mankind the gift of fire. If the British felt that the gods had brought them a gift of that magnitude, they soon found that it came at a terrible price. Social upheaval, physical hardship, and a desperate squalor that turned parts of this green and pleasant land into a living hell.
There is this view that the economy gets richer, everybody should get richer. But it took a very long time for the benefits of industrialization to spread to more of the people. And there was really a growing disparity of wealth between the very rich and the very poor, right over this whole period into the 1870s. There was a tremendous growth in population, and this population is increasingly flocking into cities. And there was never enough housing, the services were appalling, overcrowding, really very, very poor conditions. We had very early death, a lot of industrial accidents, industrial disease, a substantial likelihood of dying before the age of 45. There were no cushions at the time. We talk about the Great Victorian Boom, but it was the Great Victorian insecurity.
This was the boom or bust, rich and poor, dynamic and insecure world that Victoria inherited when, at the age of 18, she emerged from the luxurious cocoon of her palace to be crowned the Queen of England. She was not quite 5 feet tall, but she had an enormous zest for life, and like her people, she was a mass of contradictions. She ate greedily and worried about her weight, loved horse riding, loathed exercise, was described as stubborn and bad-tempered, kind and generous. The members of her government were astonished by her dignity and maturity, but she confided to her first prime minister that while walking in her gardens, she had an almost irrepressible urge to roll on the grass. Many, including the writer Thomas Carlyle, thought she would be overwhelmed by the forces that were raging outside her palace walls.
Poor little queen. She is at an age at which a girl can hardly be trusted to choose a bonnet for herself, yet a task is laid upon her from which an archangel might shrink.
Victoria had come to the throne at a time when the monarchy and the idea of empire were equally repugnant to many of her subjects. Her grandfather was the mad King George III, who had lost the American colonies. And her uncle, George IV, was so widely despised that his death was the occasion of drunken celebration in the streets of his own capital.
Victoria comes to the throne at a time when the prestige of the monarchy is drooping. Her two uncles, George IV and William IV, louche, heavy-drinking womanizers, not, if you like, in touch with their people. She comes to the throne, I think, aware that she's got to try and rescue the monarchy. She's got to make it a Christian monarchy. She is a deeply religious woman, and she sees herself as a Christian ruler over a Christian people, as a benevolent squire might look after his peasants.
But Britain was no longer a land of peasants. Victoria's subjects were leaving the farm for the factory. They were leaving their country cottages for the city slums. Britain was in the throes of the first industrial revolution in world history. It would see the birth of the factory system, the production line, the machine age. It would change not only the nature of industry, but the nature of society, perhaps even of humanity itself. Charles Dickens described one of the new factory towns where so many of Victoria's subjects were forced to live.
It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves for ever and ever. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye. Vast piles of building full of windows, out of which there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down, like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness.
This was a world far removed from that of the young queen, with her palaces and her servants. What could she know of the people who lived in such towns, or of the machines that now ruled their daily lives?
All went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound upon the same pavements, to do the same work. Every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next.
Once on a journey through this industrial heartland, the Queen caught a rare glimpse of this other world. She recoiled in shock and horror.
It is another world. In the midst of so much wealth, there seems to be nothing but chimneys, flaring furnaces with wretched cottages around them. Add to this a thick and black atmosphere, and you have but a first impression of the life which a third of my poor subjects are forced to lead.
Victoria may have been sympathetic to the plight of her people, but she lacked the skills needed to keep her country from the violent revolution that many feared was inevitable. She was shortly to be tutored, however, and more pleasantly than she could have imagined. When she was 20, a suitor was presented for Victoria's approval, her German cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg. Earlier, she had told her prime minister,
I dread the thought of marrying. I am so accustomed to having my own way, and 10 to 1 I shouldn't agree with anybody.
Now she formed a different view.
Seeing Albert has changed all this. He really is quite charming, and so excessively handsome. Such beautiful blue eyes, an exquisite nose, and such a pretty mouth with delicate mustachios. A beautiful figure, broad shoulders, and a fine waist.
Suddenly there was Albert looking resplendent, and she was ready to propose. And she did the next day. She had to propose because she was the sovereign. And of course Albert was prepared for this and ready to say yes. Suddenly he was being offered the job of consort to the greatest queen in the world. It was a job any man in his situation would look for. And he was unemployed.
the prince was summoned to attend the Queen in her drawing room.
He came where I was alone, and I said that I thought he must be aware why I wished him to come here, and that it would make me very happy if he would consent to my wishes. He said he would. I felt it was the happiest, brightest moment of my life.
Four months later, the country celebrated a royal wedding. But the official fanfare masked a distinct lack of popular enthusiasm for the marriage. As she dressed for the ceremony, Victoria was aware that many of her subjects viewed her choice of husband with dismay. Albert was foreign, and he was poor. Parliament reflected the public mood. They refused to grant Albert the title of king. In fact, they refused to grant him any title at all. During the marriage service, Victoria promised to honor and obey a husband who was now bound as a loyal subject to honor and obey her. The wife of the American ambassador, who was one of the guests, commented on the irony of an impoverished German prince endowing the Queen with all his worldly goods. Prince Albert had won the hand of a queen, but he would have a hard fight to win the hearts of her people. For the moment, the royal couple had to make do with their love for each other. Victoria wrote in her diary of her relief when they finally escaped the guests at the reception.
Then dearest Albert fetched me downstairs, where we took leave of Mamma and drove off. I and Albert, alone.
Victoria had chosen to spend the honeymoon just a few miles from London at the ancient castle of Windsor, home to the kings and queens of England since the 12th century.
The wedding night apparently went off very well, and the next morning she told the Prime Minister that they had a wonderful night and she didn't sleep much that night. And she added in her diary that dear Albert helped me put on my stockings in the morning.
To Albert's dismay, Victoria refused to take more than 4 days' break from the business of government. She gently chided him, the Queen of England. This begged the question, what then was Albert?
He knew that he would have to find something to do merely to make life bearable for himself. What was he to do other than ensure the succession? The other job he had to find, that is some kind of manly, useful work in the administration. That was hard to do because Victoria didn't want to give up anything. She wanted to reign. She wanted to rule. She wanted to be alone with her advisors and put Albert to the side. All he had to do at the start was to blot her signature. They had desks side by side in the palace, and his job was to move over to hers and blot the signatures.
When they were driving together in their carriage, it was Victoria who invariably took the reins. That provoked jokes about her holding the whip hand. It was a side of the Queen's character that caused problems for other men in her life, notably the leading members of Her Majesty's government. The Queen may have wanted to rule alone, but in reality she had to rule with the consent of Parliament. Former kings and queens of England had accepted rules binding them to choose the government from among those men who commanded a majority in the elected House of Commons. Victoria found this hard. She was a headstrong young woman who constantly kicked against the limits of her power. Her ministers soon realized that Albert had more patience for dealing with complex affairs of state, and they encouraged Victoria to include him in their regular briefings. Soon he was doing more than blot the Queen's signature, as the Queen became distracted by an event that took her mind off government business.
When Victoria became pregnant, she began to feel discomfort, the usual things that one associates with pregnancy. And so she gave more and more jobs to Albert to do. Albert began to draft her letters. Albert began to meet with her ministers. Albert became, in effect, the associate sovereign.
The chief secretary to the government noted that while Victoria had the title, Albert was really discharging the duties and functions of the sovereign. He was, to all intents and purposes, king.
Albert was an intellectual. He grasped things very quickly. He learned English very quickly. He read a great deal. He knew everything that was going on. He read all the mail that came through in the cabinet red boxes. Albert was, in effect, taking charge.
Albert had a lively interest in industry and invention, and he wanted the Queen to share it. He introduced her to developments in technology that, without his enthusiasm, might have seemed too complex, too mechanical, too grubby for her royal attention. He tried to open her eyes to the ideas and opinions that were uprooting the old Britain, ideas and opinions that were about to shake the world.
Albert thought that the world was going to change whether or not they liked it, and he wanted it to change in a way that was going to be useful for people. He wanted their standard of living improved. He wanted wealth to be better distributed. He wanted more people to have the advantages of the new inventions. In that sense, he was quite a social liberal.
In 1842, the Prince took a trip on one of the new railroads, the Great Western that linked London with the port of Bristol on the west coast of England. The 120-mile journey would have taken 15 hours by stagecoach. The railroad did it in 3. Waiting for him at the end of the line was the man who had built it, a man whose name had a ring of grandeur to match the age he lived in, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was the most famous engineer in the world, and he devoted his life to making it a smaller place. Victoria had inherited an empire that spanned the globe, but her scattered possessions were separated by thousands of miles of ocean. In the days of sail, it could take 3 months to cross the Atlantic, 6 to reach India, even longer to make the passage to the Queen's dominions of Australia and New Zealand. Brunel mastered the technology to weld these disparate elements into an empire. He had conceived of the SS Great Britain as the first all-iron steamship, doubling the size of any ship ever built before. She was designed to cut the journey time across the Atlantic from around 3 months to a reliable 15 days. Brunel personified the spirit of limitless ambition that was to be the hallmark of Victoria's empire. He seized the opportunity of Prince Albert's visit to convince him of the potential of this dynamic new method of transport. Steamships had been ridiculed by their critics, who argued that they would need so much coal for their engines there would be no space left for cargo. Brunel demolished this myth with a complex mathematical equation. In simple terms, he proved that the bigger the ship, the bigger the proportion that could be used for cargo or passengers or troops. It was the beginning of the end for the great days of sail. The SS Great Britain would be the first of this new breed of ocean steamers that would bind the mother country ever more closely to her imperial possessions. And their ability to steam in a straight line regardless of winds or currents would have a vital impact on one of the other great inventions of the Victorian age. In 1837, inventors on both sides of the Atlantic had simultaneously created the electric telegraph. Brunel argued that his railroads provided a perfect route for the telegraph wires that would link city to city, while his steamships could lay telegraph cables across the seas to link nation to nation. Brunel inspired the young prince with the vision of the first modern empire, an empire based not on conquest, but on commerce and communication.
In 1845, Britain was a global superpower. It had a monopoly of the latest technology based upon steam. It also possessed the greatest capacity for manufacturing and a vast surplus of capital. Now, if these assets are to be used to their best effect, British businessmen had to sell cheaply and buy cheaply. And in the 1840s, it was clear that Britain could no longer produce enough food for its people, so it needed inexpensive food.
The vision of a modern technological empire was threatened by the lack of the most basic commodity in the world, grain. Despite the new inventions, British agriculture could not provide enough bread to feed the millions who had flocked to the cities in search of work. They threatened riot and rebellion. America could supply vast quantities of grain, but this was opposed by the most powerful lobby in Victoria's empire. The landlords, the squires, were the dominant power in Parliament. Their wealth came from agriculture, and they were determined to maintain a high price for their crops, especially grain. They used their votes in Parliament to impose high import duties on foreign grain, the infamous Corn Laws, and they would bring the country to the brink of armed insurrection. Prince Albert warned the Queen of the serious danger of civil war with the manufacturers, the hungry, and the poor lined up against the aristocracy, warned that this could only end in the ruin of the aristocracy and the end of the monarchy, that it could even threaten Victoria's life. The crisis came to a head in Britain's oldest colony, Ireland. In the reign of Victoria, the whole of Ireland belonged to Britain. Most of the country was owned by English landlords who rarely visited their estates in Ireland. Their tenants were poor Irish farmers. Most grew nothing but potatoes, which was all they had to eat. An English traveler noted the grave inequality in wealth.
Landlords first get all that is made of the land, and the tenants, for their labor, get poverty and potatoes.
In 1845, the Irish potato crop was hit by a mysterious blight that turned the tubers black and rotten. The harvest was ruined. Eyewitnesses chronicled the growing anguish and despair.
Distress and fear were pictured on every face. The wretched people wringing their hands and wailing bitterly against the destruction that had left them foodless.
For a while, they lived on nettles and other weeds. Then they began to starve. English magistrates filed grim reports.
I entered some of the hovels. In the first, 6 famished skeletons, to all appearances dead, were huddled in a corner. I approached with horror, found by their low moaning that they were still alive.
Captain Wynne, English Army officer.
Mothers shivering in the snow and sleet, uttering exclamations of despair, while the children scream with hunger. I am a match for anything else I may meet with here, but this I cannot stand.
The government provided aid in the form of work and food, but nowhere near enough. The Queen wrote from Windsor Castle to complain that the government corn was not reaching the people who were starving.
After all we have done to supply the needy with food, the landlords appropriate the people's corn and use the employment of the poor to improve their properties at the public expense.
She was horrified to learn that the dead were being buried without coffins in mass graves. In 1846, an American traveler took a boat to the Western Isles.
Nothing of life was seen or heard except occasionally a dog. I thoughtlessly said, "How can the dogs look so fat and sleek when there is no food for the people?" "Shall I tell her?" said the pilot.
As the dogs scavenged among the graves, 1.5 million people starved to death. Many tenants who could not pay their rents were evicted by their landlords. 2 million Irish emigrated in disease-ridden hulks known as coffin ships. Those who survived the voyage were herded into the slums of New York and Boston, Liverpool and Glasgow. It was one of the greatest human disasters in history. The British Parliament was split. On one side were the landlords. On the other were the free traders who warned that unless the Corn Laws were repealed, they all risked the danger of violent revolution. But the landlords held out, rallied by a man who was destined to become one of the outstanding statesmen of the age, Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli was an unlikely champion of the landed interest. Though he had been baptized, his family was Jewish at a time when Jews were barred from public office in England. The young Disraeli had the elegant style of a man of means, but it was mostly bluff. He had no money, no land, no friends in high places. He joked that he had been born in a library, and his father certainly had one of the largest libraries in London. At the age of 20, Disraeli gave up the practice of law to write romantic novels. But his main purpose in writing was to pay off the huge debts he'd incurred from dabbling on the stock market. His real interest was in politics.
Disraeli's entry into politics was very difficult indeed. He was constantly heckled for being a Jew. People would turn up at the hustings with, with donkeys saying, "Go back to Jerusalem." I mean, he encountered a lot of very rough and rather nasty anti-Semitism. And yet he had one of the great things about Disraeli, I think, was his determination.
When he finally made it to Parliament, his florid style of speech and dress caused a sensation.
He dressed in clothes that amazed people. He wore wonderful coloured outfits. He wore lots of jewellery. He wore sort of chains all over his waistcoat and rings outside his gloves, and he had very tightly ringleted hair. He liked shocking people.
And he certainly succeeded in shocking the House of Commons. His first speech had been drowned out by a torrent of laughter and abuse.
Sit down! Aye, sir. And though I sit down now, the time will come when you will hear me.
Disraeli modified his dress and tailored his speeches to the mood of Parliament. And with the battle over the Corn Laws, his time had come.
A lot of these country gentlemen really were not very good on their feet, but Disraeli was a brilliant orator.
Right or wrong, if they be in the wrong, they must...
It gave him the opportunity he'd been waiting for.
With which our present rulers...
But Disraeli's opportunism earned him many enemies in Parliament. By far the most important of these was William Ewart Gladstone. Gladstone's father had owned slaves in the West Indies, and Gladstone was tormented by a deep sense of guilt, which helped make him the conscience of the British Empire.
The most important thing in Gladstone's life is that whenever he has any problem, any political problem, he speaks to God. He asks for God's guidance. God is at the center of his life, at the center of his whole political being. And when he looks at imperialism, he says, is this godly? And he decides it isn't.
Gladstone had been elected to Parliament as a Tory, but the Irish famine wrenched at his conscience, and he switched sides to join the Liberals and Free Traders. The resulting battle would spark a lifelong feud between the two politicians, Disraeli and Gladstone, a feud that would divide Victorian England. But there was no doubt whose side the Queen was on. When Parliament finally voted on the repeal of the Corn Laws, Prince Albert appeared in the public gallery to demonstrate royal support for the Free Traders. Abuse from the Tory benches forced him to leave, and the Queen issued a fierce attack on his critics.
Gentlemen who do nothing but hunt all day, drink claret or port wine in the evening, and never study or read about any of these questions.
The Free Traders eventually won over enough Tories to break the landlord's power. The Corn Laws were repealed, and Britain finally opened its doors to the grain harvests of America.
The ayes have it.
Many feared it was too late. The stubborn resistance of the landlords had provoked popular fury in the towns and cities of Britain, and at a dangerous time for the British royal family. 1848 would prove to be the year of revolution. It began in southern Italy and spread rapidly across the continent of Europe. Armed mobs exploded into the streets, storming the palaces of their rulers and raising the red flag of revolution. From the sanctuary of her medieval palace at Windsor, the Queen confided to her uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians,
"The state of politics in Europe is very critical, and one feels very anxious for the future."
Revolution would eventually topple the thrones of France, Russia, Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, and Turkey. And it was not only Victoria's throne that was at risk. The shots missed, but it was the first serious attempt on Victoria's life, and it would not be the last. In the spring of 1848, Victoria's government feared that the revolution had spread to Britain. Their agents warned that 1 million men were planning to gather in London for a march on Parliament. Panic gripped the capital. Cannon were posted on the bridges across the River Thames. Thousands of police and troops were brought into the city. The fearful government smuggled the royal family aboard a train to take them to their seaside palace off the south coast of England.
Albert was very frightened. Victoria was frightened. She did not want to go. She felt that it would look unheroic to leave. But it looked as if there might be a real revolution.
As the royal family was hurried to safety, London braced itself for the invasion of 1 million men bent on bloody revolution. But on the morning of April 10th, just 30,000 demonstrators turned up. They were outnumbered by over 100,000 troops and special constables. At the first spark of violence, the leaders of the protest lost their nerve. They implored the crowd to disperse. Then the weather took a hand. The threatened revolution was drowned in a violent outbreak of English rain.
They expected hundreds of thousands of people to gather and march across the bridges to Parliament and present this monster petition. Very few people actually turned up. It was a great disappointment. The English just aren't revolutionists.
When the news reached the Queen in her seaside refuge, she rejoiced.
Thank God. The procession has turned out a complete failure. The loyalty of the people at large has been very striking, and their indignation at their peace being interfered with by such wanton and worthless men, immense.
But Prince Albert had a much more realistic view of the situation. The revolution had been averted, but the threat remained as strong as ever. Albert believed that the only way to preserve the monarchy was to improve the conditions of the poor. The British people had to be persuaded that free trade would bring in a new age of peace and prosperity, not just for the manufacturers, but for the whole nation. The problem was, how are they to be convinced?
Albert liked the idea of using trade to liberalize the world in general. He liked the idea of trade creating communications and a better life for people worldwide.
Prince Albert believed that free trade was not just an economic theory, it was almost a sort of religion. Free trade would provide universal happiness throughout the world.
In 1849, Prince Albert met one of the great prophets of this new religion, Henry Cole, writer, artist, architect, and one of those Victorian gentlemen who buzzed with ideas that could change the world. He told the prince of his bold new dream. They would build a cathedral of free trade, a giant temple in the heart of London to exhibit the art and industry of all nations. Every country in the world would be invited to send the most beautiful and the most useful of its creations to London, to unite the world in a dream of universal peace through trade. The prince was enthralled.
Prince Albert was in many ways a very idealistic figure. And this was not only to project the majesty of Great Britain across the world, it was also to emphasize the fact that we were all interconnected.
Victoria shared Albert's enthusiasm and appointed him president of a royal commission to organize what would be known as the Great Exhibition of the Works and Industry of All Nations, the world's first international trade fair. The Queen offered one of the royal parks, Hyde Park in the center of London, as the site for the exhibition. But Prince Albert's vision was resisted by the same forces that had opposed the repeal of the Corn Laws. First, they objected that it would bring hordes of foreigners into London.
Well, there was very great concern about the invasion of foreigners into this country. Xenophobia, I think, was quite rife at that time. There was concerns about disease being brought into the city.
The critics then shifted their attack to the building itself. The plan first chosen by the Royal Commission resembled a giant dome. It was held to ridicule, but when it was revealed that a famous avenue of trees would have to be cut down to make room for it, the mirth turned to anger. Save the Trees became a popular rallying cry for Albert's critics in press and Parliament.
Are the trees to be sacrificed for one of the greatest frauds, greatest humbugs, greatest absurdities ever known?
The real target of this attack was Prince Albert himself. He was mocked as the uncrowned king of the royal nursery, the foreign stud who could sire 9 children, but was fit for little else. But behind the mockery was the fear that Albert represented a threat to the established order.
In many ways, Albert was far ahead of his time. People in government didn't want to move as fast as Albert wanted to move. And so he became something of a suspect person to the politicians who were more conservative than he was.
Victoria and Albert were at their wits' end. It wasn't just Albert's reputation that was at stake. It was their dream. The dream that world trade could secure world peace. The prince wrote to his brother Ernst in despair.
We shall probably be defeated and have to give up the whole exhibition. You see, we do not lie on a bed of roses.
Then, with the project on the verge of collapse, help came from an unexpected source. Joseph Paxton was a farmer's son. He had started work at the age of 15 as an undergardener on the great estate of the Duke of Devonshire in the north of England. But like Brunel and Cole and so many other Victorians, Paxton had enormous self-belief and an imagination that soared beyond the limits of the Duke's plantations. His ideas for improvements caught the attention of his noble employer. They earned him rapid promotion. By the age of 40, he was manager of all the Duke's estates and an independently wealthy man with investments in bridges, railways, and gasworks. He even founded a newspaper with Charles Dickens as its editor. Paxton was the typical Victorian entrepreneur who seemed to excel at anything and everything. He knew that Prince Albert's exhibition was doomed without a building, so he turned his mind to designing one. He produced a preliminary sketch on a piece of blotting paper during a board meeting of one of his railroad companies. It was a giant greenhouse. Prince Albert and his team were delighted. A building made of glass could be assembled quickly and would do away with the need to cut down the trees in Hyde Park. The critics were felled with one stroke. In the fall of 1850, an army of 2,000 workmen descended on Hyde Park. The vast iron framework covering 19 acres of land was erected in just 9 weeks. The following week, 80 glaziers fitted 18,000 panes of glass. The critics prayed for a violent hailstorm, but it was a forlorn hope. Paxton's beautiful building won the hearts of the nation. It was opened by the Queen and Prince Albert on the 1st of May, 1851, and instantly became known as the Crystal Palace.
As far as the public is concerned, it was architecturally magical. It was such a marvelous building, it was so unlike anything that anybody had seen before, that in itself, I think, set the thing off on a marvelous passage.
For the first time, the Victorians saw their brave new world on show, with all its novelty and invention, and they were bewitched.
There was a tremendous impact. Everyone was excited to see this whole building and what was contained within inside it. Within 3 months, over 6 million people visited. And when you consider the London population at that time was just over 2 million, that shows it had a tremendous international impact.
But it was the achievements of British industry that entranced the crowds who flocked to the Crystal Palace. The Great Exhibition was Britain's show. No other country came close in the production of steam engines, machine tools, the symbols of industrial might.
You'll go in and you'll see all these wonderful gadgets, all these inventions, all this evidence of British ingenuity and of British energy. And it's an advertisement to the world which says, this is the most progressive nation in the world. Look what it's produced. Isn't this marvelous?
Even the restrained columns of the Times newspaper swelled with rapture.
Those who were so fortunate as to see it hardly knew what most to admire. Around them, amidst them, above their heads was all that was beautiful and useful in nature or in art. Above them rose a glittering arch, far more lofty and spacious than the vaults of even our noblest cathedrals. Some were reminded of that day when all ages and climes would be gathered around the throne of their Maker.
The Crystal Palace achieved all that Prince Albert had hoped for and more. It convinced millions of ordinary people that the new technology could deliver a golden future not just for the rich and privileged, but for them all. It fired an enormous sense of patriotism and pride in the monarchy. But it also provoked feelings of national supremacy, a growing conviction that with such engines of power, the British could conquer the world. After the opening ceremony, the Queen gave thanks.
God bless my dear Albert. God bless my dearest country, which has shown itself so noble. Albert's name is immortalized.
The Prince, with more restraint, commented that the day's events had been quite satisfactory. The Great Exhibition marked the dawn of a new era of free trade. But Prince Albert's vision of world peace and the brotherhood of nations would prove more elusive.
Free trade is, in a sense, a form of imperialism, insofar as if anyone tries to oppose it, then the British government will take action against them, literally at the point of a cannon.
In the decade that followed the Crystal Palace, Britain would be plunged into two great conflicts that shattered Albert's illusions and set Victoria's empire on a dangerous and bloody route towards world domination. In the course of Victoria's long reign, 16 million Britons would leave the mother country for a new life overseas. Each of them, whether they were searching for fame or fortune, love or adventure, would help to make the empire of Queen Victoria the widest and most powerful the world has ever seen.
There was the feeling that this island, though then very, very beautiful, peaceful, proud, rich, in all ways successful. Nevertheless, it was cramped, it was small, it was drizzly. And over there, you know, at the end of the shipping routes, there was somewhere warm and hot and exciting. Temple bells rang, and ships sailed over limitless seas, and soldiers fought. It was a marvelous vision for somebody growing up in this little island here.
But whatever their personal dreams and ambitions, these hopeful emigrants took with them a baggage of ideas and values, beliefs and prejudices that would spread to the further corners of the earth and soak a significant part of it in blood. Most of those leaving the mother country in the 1850s were heading for the Queen's self-governing dominions of Canada, Australia and New Zealand, or the former colonies of the United States. Others were bound for the country that Victoria would one day describe as the most precious jewel in her crown, India. India was the greatest overseas territory that any empire has ever possessed. But it had been conquered not by the British Army, but by a private trading company. The East India Company had begun with a single warehouse on the west coast of India. When its trade was threatened by European rivals or Indian rulers, the company went to war. It employed its own private army of native troops, commanded by British and European officers. They won battle after battle. With each victory, thousands of new Indian recruits came over from the ranks of their defeated opponents. They swore an oath to their new employer.
To serve the Honorable Company faithfully and truly against all their enemies, while I continue to receive their pay and eat their salt.
That oath of loyalty was the most important single strand binding the British to India, and the most vulnerable. By the time of Victoria, the East India Company, with its vast native army, controlled a swath of territory across India 10 times the size of the British Isles, and with 5 times the population. The merchant adventurers had become conquerors, and to the victors went the spoils. The hookah-smoking agents or nabobs of the East India Company became a byword for splendid living and riches beyond the dreams of their countrymen in England.
They were generally well-educated, upper-middle-class Englishmen who went out partly to make money, as they nearly always did, but also to have fun and to have excitement and to have a bit of romance and to go somewhere where the horizons were wider and the opportunities were greater and the loot was better. There was no improving intention. They weren't bigoted at all, so many of them had Indian friends. Some of them had Indian wives. A lot of them had Indian mistresses and produced many Anglo-Indian children.
The Indian mistress, or Bibi as she was known, was an important, almost official feature of company life. Traditionally, she was installed in a house known as a bibigar, where she lived in some luxury with her children and servants. In its early days, the company had encouraged its white employees to take Indian wives, but the bibi had become the approved alternative. Bibis steadied the men, it was argued, and rooted the company in Indian soil. One officer wrote wistfully of the bibis,
"They are so amusingly playful, so anxious to please a person, one shrinks from the idea of encountering the whims or yielding to the furies of an Englishwoman."
One Englishwoman in particular was not amused. The high-spirited young woman who had become Queen of England at 18 had matured into a proud and sometimes priggish wife and mother. She and Prince Albert believed in what would become known as Victorian values, in particular, the sanctity of home and family and the supremacy of the Protestant religion. They were values shared by most of Victoria's British subjects, rich or poor. Despite the squalor and poverty of their own cities, the Victorians began to see themselves as God's chosen people, with a mission to spread the gospel to other lands.
All of these things come together around this period, around sort of 1815 onwards, to develop a very new attitude within Britain, a feeling that they are the face of the future, really, and a desire to now to impose this on others. They feel they have a duty to do this, to civilize people, and this is known as the civilizing mission. And from this date onwards, really, there is a great change in the attitude of the British to the Indian people.
This feeling coincided with new inventions and initiatives that would bring the two worlds of England and India closer together, with horrific results for both. In the days before the Suez Canal, the passage from England to India was round the southern tip of Africa, a journey of some 14,000 miles that could take up to 6 months by sailing ship. But in 1837, the first year of Victoria's reign, the East India Company employed a retired naval officer to find a faster route. Thomas Waghorn was typical of the Victorians who would expand the British Empire. Part adventurer, part visionary, part man of business. He proposed a shortcut to India, across Egypt and down the Red Sea. Most people thought he was mad. The overland journey across Egypt was plagued by bandits, and the Red Sea was prone to sudden storms. That made it hazardous for large sailing ships. But Britain had pioneered the age of steam, and Waghorn gambled that steamships could operate on the Red Sea without fear of wind or current. As a coaling station, he used the port of Aden, the first colony acquired in Victoria's reign. Soon, regular services were plying the Red Sea between Aden and Suez. More traditional methods were employed to smooth the journey across Egypt: camels, carriages, and hefty bribes to buy off the bandits. Before long, Waghorn was running a thriving business. But his shortcut to the Orient would stir up unexpected trouble in India. The long sea voyage around the Cape had deterred many English women from joining their menfolk in the Far East. But Waghorn's shortcut made the passage to India much easier for them. In addition to the wives came thousands of young women who hoped to attract one of the company's eligible bachelors. These women were to have a dramatic effect on the way of life enjoyed by the men who ran India.
With the coming of the women, there was increasing tendency to establish separate enclaves for Europeans, known as cantonments, which were usually on the outskirts of cities. And in these places, the Europeans were able to live in their own houses. They would socialize together. They wouldn't even go into the town to do their shopping. They had their own cantonment shops, so that they never had to go to the native bazaar. So they were completely enclosed. And in this situation, the European women had really very little contact with the outside world. Their main contact with the Indians was with servants, and these were people whom they commanded as inferiors. They learnt some basic Hindi words, which were often the most insulting forms of address to people. But they did this because this was the way you addressed your servants.
For another thing, of course, there was the sexual aspect of it. They didn't want their menfolk to be associated with Indian women, understandably so, really. But that meant that the Gulf was driven through the relationship between Britons and Indians.
The amusingly playful Bibi was pushed into the shadows, slowly, but not entirely, receding. Now, instead of spending his off-duty hours in the Bibi Gar or with his men in the native quarters, the company officer was expected to retire to his bungalow and the bosom of his English family. It was a bosom that often quivered with righteous indignation at what was glimpsed of the world beyond the European compound. The daughter of an English merchant in Lucknow complained bitterly.
The streets are never known to be swept, and flies abound in such numbers that sometimes the shops can only be opened at night. Besides which, the place is infested with monkeys that unscrupulously walk off with all they can lay their hands upon.
Such women were scandalized by tales of the pleasures sampled by the native rulers in the privacy of their royal palaces, and by those more widely available in the natch houses of the native quarters. It was not only English women who demanded change. The same steamships from England brought out missionaries who were determined to make India not only more civilized, but more Christian.
The missionaries who came were very intolerant of Indian religions, particularly Hinduism, which they saw as a religion of superstition, of dirt and squalor, but also of idol worship.
We must unite to condemn the barbarous and obscene rites of Hindu superstition.
The chairman of the East India Company, himself a fervent evangelist, suggested that the company might do more in India than just make money.
We might diffuse among their inhabitants, long sunk in darkness, vice, misery, the light and benign influence of the truth.
There were obviously some practices carried on in India which were, by any standards, reprehensible.
The most disturbing of these practices was the Hindu tradition of sati, burning a widow alive on her dead husband's funeral pyre, ritually prepared by the priest with water, milk, and honey. When a delegation of Indian notables protested that sati was a time-honored custom of their people, General Sir Charles Napier spoke for many of his countrymen.
My people, too, have a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them.
We can justify the British attempts to root out these practices, but I don't think we can justify the way that they were made into symbols of Indian degeneracy.
There were too many young men in a hurry in India. They come out to Britain, from Britain, with the best of intentions, believing that they had come to India, were about to remake the country, had come as civilizers. And at the same time, many of them were quite fervent evangelical Christians. They were contemptuous of Indian beliefs, openly ridiculed Indian religions and customs, and behaved in a way which suggested to a lot of Indians that the momentum of change was quickening and that it was unstoppable.
Some Indians decided to make a stand. They would fight and die to defend their religions and culture. One of them was a young Muslim called Azamullah Khan. He would prove to be one of Britain's most deadly enemies. Azimullah's dealings with the British began as a child when he was brought by his mother to a Christian mission in the north of India. Famine was stalking the region, and mother and child were starving. The mission took them in. Azim Mullah was educated in the mission school where he learned to speak English and French. But he had been born a Muslim, and he resisted all attempts to convert him to Christianity. When he left the mission, he took a job as khidmatgar, or butler, in the home of an English family. He joined a great army of servants who catered to the needs of the British in India. From the relays of punkawallas who fanned the air in the stifling bungalows, to the trusted ayahs who looked after the children, and to the lofty khidmatgars who served at table. Many remained faithful to their British families through a lifetime of service. But others nursed a bitter, even murderous resentment against the sahibs and mem-sahibs whose whims they had to satisfy. Such a man was Azimullah Khan. In the 1850s, Azimullah joined the followers of an Indian nobleman with his own grievances against the British. Nana Sahib was the leader of a once mighty Hindu nation, the Marathas, who had been defeated by the armies of the East India Company. Nana's father had been paid an annual pension by the company to keep his family in princely style and to maintain a small army. But when his father died, the pension died with him. His enraged heir, Nana Sahib, decided to appeal to the directors of the East India Company in London, and the man he chose to represent him was Azimullah Khan. In 1853, Azimullah traveled to Britain, expecting to see the great source of power that had so impressed Muslim writers before him.
It cannot be without the will of that one supreme being that this small island, which seems on the globe like a mole on the body of man, should command the greater part of the world and keep the rest in awe.
But Azimullah was astonished by the smoke and squalor of London. Here was none of the wealth and dignity maintained by the British in India. Instead, he saw the drunks and the whores, the beggars and the street urchins. Whole families trudging to factories and workshops. In the engine room of empire, the smoke and the dirt blinded Azimullah to the power and the wealth. When the East India Company rejected his appeal on behalf of Nana Sahib, Azimullah was indignant.
England will yet regret the manner in which it has used my master.
It seemed an empty threat, but fate would provide him with the opportunity and the weapon. As Azimullah began his return journey, the British rushed headlong into the first major war of Victoria's reign. It was provoked by fears for the security of the overland link to India pioneered by Thomas Waghorn. In the spring of 1854, Russian armies were sweeping through the Balkans and the British public clamored for action.
First of all, people thought, well, the overland route must be protected. The whole of the Middle East was suddenly seen as a defensive barrier. If somehow someone got across the Middle East, they could invade India. Well, after all, all these statesmen and generals had all learnt in their public schools about Alexander the Great. He'd done it, so why couldn't someone else? What if the Russians try and follow Alexander the Great? The Tsar had 1 million men. The figure was always said, 1 million men, and he could somehow march them to India. What would the Indian people do? Would they support the British, or would they support the invader?
But the government was divided. The Prime Minister wrote to the Queen,
"No doubt it may be very agreeable to humiliate the Emperor of Russia, but it is paying a little too dear for the pleasure to cover Europe with confusion, misery, and blood."
It was a view shared by Victoria's German-born husband, Prince Albert. His opposition to war became widely known, and the public turned on him in fury. Albert wrote to his brother,
"The public has graciously selected me as its scapegoat to answer for its not yet having come to war."
The English aristocracy had never accepted the prince as one of their own. They sneered at his dress, the open-necked collar and the thigh-length boots he wore to go hunting. Not the English style at all. A letter to the Times wryly speculated on the reasons he was disliked by the upper classes.
"He does not gamble, does not use offensive language, and does not keep an opera dancer."
The Queen suggested another.
It is that unbounded dislike in England of foreigners which breaks out continually and is very painful.
A damaging rumor was circulated that Albert was secretly in the pay of the Russians.
Albert did not want war. He felt that whatever was going to happen could be settled peacefully. And when he tried to settle it peacefully, when he tried to get the nations to think in terms of a conference to end the war, he found that people saw him as pro-Russian. And at one point there was a rumor spreading about London that Albert had been arrested as a spy, and thousands of people went to the Tower of London to stare up and see where Albert was, peering out of a window perhaps, a barred window in the tower. Of course he wasn't there, this was nonsense, but it gives you an idea of how Albert was thought of at that time.
From somewhat more comfortable quarters in the royal palace of Windsor, the prince wrote to friends in Germany.
"We might fancy we are living in a madhouse. The stupidest trash is babbled to the public, so stupid you would not give it to the pigs to litter in."
The madness against Albert passed, but not the fever for war. In March 1854, a British fleet sailed for the Black Sea with 30,000 troops. They joined French and Turkish forces in an attack on the Russian naval base of Sebastopol in the Crimea. With the outbreak of hostilities, Albert knew where his duty lay. He embarked for France to review the troops assembled for dispatch to the Crimea and cement the shaky alliance with the French Emperor. Charles Dickens was on vacation in France when he saw the two men riding past at the head of a troop of cavalry. Albert's diplomacy was a great success. Dickens saw bonfires lit all along the coast to celebrate the alliance between Britain and France. Dickens made his own contribution by lighting 120 candles in the window of his rented cottage on the cliffs above the English Channel. But in the Crimea, there was little to celebrate. It had been 40 years since the British Army had fought a major war. It was ill-prepared and worse led.
The army that went to the Crimea hadn't been in action in any meaningful way since the Battle of Waterloo 40 years before, but it was exactly the same. The weaponry, the training, the systems, everything was exactly the same as it had been during the Napoleonic Wars. The world had moved on since then, but the army hadn't. And Lord Raglan, who was the commander of the Victorian Army, had no military experience. He'd never commanded as much as a platoon. So they went out there, and practically everything that could go wrong went wrong.
A British officer described the conditions.
The men stand day and night in trenches full of water, holding their muskets in their cramped and half-frozen hands, the rain soaking the only clothes they have in the world, which once wet will remain damp forever in this climate.
The conditions of the troops was absolutely awful. That they had virtually no supplies, no medical backup at all. They were starving. They were running with lice. They had no tents. They lived in waterlogged trenches. It was a small, ghastly pre-run, if you like, of the Great War.
Britain's allies were better equipped and better nourished. A dragoon in the French army reported that the British were so desperate they would exchange their boots for something to eat.
We give them what we can. It is pitiful to see such superb men asking permission to gorge themselves on the dregs in our mess tins.
Dysentery and cholera swept the ranks, and disease was followed by fatal blunders on the field of battle. The Crimea witnessed the most memorable single fiasco in British military history, the charge of the Light Brigade. The Light Brigade was the finest cavalry force in Europe, but it was commanded by George Brudenell, Earl of Cardigan, who treated war as just another aristocratic hobby like fox hunting. He was sent a written order to recover some British cannon that had been seized by the Russians to his right.
Cardigan read this and looked around, and the only guns he could see were the Russian guns directly to his front and other Russian guns on either flank. So, being as he was a rather impetuous officer and not one endowed with brains, he decided to attack. His wonderful last line as he drew his sword was, "Here go the last of the Brudenells," because he was in no doubt that if they went into that valley, most of them weren't coming out. And it was a total shambles.
Cardigan led the Light Brigade into the wrong valley, a valley lined on three sides with Russian artillery. The carnage was described by his men in flashes of horrific detail.
We advanced at a gallop amid a fearful fire from front, left and right of grape, shell and canister. Horses and men fell thick and fast.
Bleeding objects in one's path. Sometimes a man, sometimes a horse.
They were cut to pieces. They did actually reach the Russian guns and killed the Russian gunners. And all around, on the slopes, people were watching, aghast, with their hands over their eyes.
Of the 600 men who charged into the Valley of Death, nearly half rode back alive. 30,000 troops had been sent to the Crimea. Within a year, 2/3 were dead or wounded. For the first time in the history of conflict, the suffering of the men and the failings of the generals were described in graphic detail to the public at home. For the Crimea introduced the world's first war correspondent, William Russell, of the London Times.
The noblest army ever sent from these shores has been sacrificed to the grossest mismanagement. Incompetence, lethargy and stupidity reign, revel and riot in the camp before Sebastopol and in the hospitals of Scutari.
Among the millions who read Russell's dispatches was the embittered Indian envoy Azimullah Khan. As a result, he decided to make a detour on his way back to India to see for himself what was happening to the British Army in the Crimea. He toured the hospitals where a woman called Florence Nightingale was fighting to save the lives of the British wounded and bring some order to the chaos. Even in the slums of London, Azimullah had never seen the British brought so low. It reinforced his belief that they were far from invincible. On his return to India, Azim Mullah faced an uncomfortable meeting with Nana Sahib. He had failed to win back the prince's titles and pensions, and he had spent lavishly of his master's funds. But Azim Mullah had rehearsed an argument that he hoped would save him from Nana Sahib's displeasure. The British were finished, he claimed. All they needed was a final push, and then the disinherited ruler could take all that was due to him, and more. He could exact a savage revenge for all the humiliations heaped upon him by the East India Company. Over the next few months, Azim Mullah's agents joined other dissident Indians in a campaign of rumor and subversion. They fanned the smoldering resentment aroused by the evangelists who appeared to threaten the sacred beliefs of Hindu and Muslim alike. They whispered that the British had been defeated in the Crimea and that a Russian army was now advancing on India. None of this was true. It was the Russians who had been defeated. But the rumor was widely believed. The British agents of the East India Company were puzzled and alarmed. As tensions rose, they tried to keep their fears from their families. But their only security rested in the native troops of the East India Company. Sikhs, Gurkhas, Pathans, Hindus, and Muslims. By the 1850s, their ranks had swollen to over 260,000. More than 10 times the number of British soldiers stationed in India, and more than twice the size of the entire British army around the world. Their loyalty was vital if the British were to remain in India. And in the wake of the Crimean War, the company made a seemingly trivial decision that would prove disastrous. British instructors began to train their Indian troops to use a new rifle, the Lee Enfield, with a cartridge that was greased with animal fat. A rumor spread that the grease was made from a mixture of beef and pork, one forbidden to Hindus, the other to Muslims. It triggered a revolt known to the British as the Indian Mutiny, and to the Indians as the First War of Independence.
The immediate reason for the revolt was the belief amongst many of the Indian soldiers that they were being polluted deliberately by the British with the cartridges which had either beef or pork fat. However, once it actually started, a whole range of grievances came to the fore, which were connected with the things that the British had been doing in the preceding 30 years.
The revolt began in the garrison town of Meerut in the far north, when 90 troopers refused to handle the new cartridges. The soldiers were publicly stripped of their uniforms and sentenced to 10 years hard labor. The next day was a Sunday, May the 10th, 1857. As the British settled down after the church service, their slumbers were disturbed by the sound of gunfire. Native troops had stormed the prison and released their 90 comrades. Then, joined by a mob from the bazaar, they charged into the British quarter. Barracks and bungalows were torched. Men, women, and children were slaughtered. The Great Mutiny had begun. At first, it was confined to one area in the north. The isolated British garrisons throughout India held their breath to see if the mutiny would spread. So too did Nana Sahib. Despite the urgings of Azimullah Khan and others, he held back until he knew how the British would react. Just a few miles from his palace was the garrison town of Kanpur, a magnet for many of the young women who had left Britain in search of a husband. One of them had been lent a piano by Nana Sahib, who was friendly with several of the British families in the garrison. Sincerely or not, Nana Sahib assured them that he would protect British women and children with his personal army if local Indian troops joined the mutiny. Throughout May, the peace held, and the British did their best to continue as usual. It was the calm before the storm. On June 4, 1857, the Indian troops attacked their British officers and set fire to their quarters. The entire European community of 1,000 men, women, and children fled to a half-built barrack block on the edge of the city, hastily fortified against attack. 2 days later, Nana Sahib joined the rebels with his own army and took personal command of the siege. The makeshift fortress was raked by cannon and musket fire. Azimullah mockingly called it Fort Despair. On June 10th, news of the revolt reached Britain, and 30,000 troops were sent to deal with the crisis. But it would take several months for the slow-moving troop ships to reach India. Meanwhile, at Kanpur and nearby Lucknow, the beleaguered British garrisons held out week after week under constant bombardment.
Several hundred women were besieged within makeshift defenses, gradually whittled away, several of them having babies as went along, disease coming in, of course, lack of food. It was a most horrific experience.
One of the women, 18-year-old Amelia Horn, described the horrors in detail.
Every shot that struck the barracks was followed by heart-rending shrieks of women and children who were either killed outright by the projectiles or crushed to death by falling beams, masonry and splinters. Sometimes a whole family would be found lying dead, side by side.
The only source of water was a well swept by sniper fire.
On one occasion, we were obliged to drink some water mixed with human blood from the wounds of a native nurse or ayah, who, while standing nearby, had both her legs carried away by the bursting of a shell.
On June 12th, the hospital block was set alight by shell fire, burning many of the wounded to death and destroying all the remaining medical supplies.
No relief whatever could now be offered to the sick and wounded. There was nothing now to soothe their dying moments. The heat affected their wounds, and the flies settled on them and drove them crazy. It was now that our skirts were in demand. We tore every vestige to supply bandages for the wounded.
On the 25th of June, 1857, Nana Sahib offered a deal. If the British would move out, he guaranteed safe conduct for the survivors to leave Kanpur by boat down the river Ganges. They had no choice but to accept. The point of departure was a Hindu temple where the faithful took their ritual baths. A fleet of boats had been assembled with native crews to punt the survivors to safety. Thatched awnings protected them from the heat of the sun. But as the Europeans climbed aboard, the boatmen leapt ashore, scattering burning embers from their cooking stoves. Hundreds of native troops emerged from hiding and fired volley after volley into the burning boats. Mounted troopers rode into the water, slashing down with their sabers. Over 500 men, women, and children died in the massacre of Kanpur. Just 4 men escaped downriver to tell the tale. About 120 women and children who had survived the slaughter were rounded up on the riverbank. The captives were herded into a building where the Indian mistress of a British officer had once lived, known as a Bibi Ghar. But help was finally on the way. A scratch force of 1,000 Scottish Highlanders, a few English Fusiliers, and some loyal Sikhs had been sent from other parts of India. They marched down the Grand Trunk Road in the full heat of the Indian summer. Nana Sahib set out to confront them at the head of 5,000 rebels. The new rifles played a key role, picking the rebels off at long range. The result was a victory for the British. The survivors fled back to the city to warn their supporters.
The British are coming like mad beasts, caring for neither cannon nor musketry.
At the Bibi Ghar, the number of captives had risen to 180 women and children, crowded into the 3 rooms and courtyard of the house. They included the 2 young friends who, barely 5 weeks before, had been playing chamber music on Nana Sahib's piano. Many of the prisoners were wounded, dying of cholera and other infections, or broken by heat and despair. A few recorded their experiences on scraps of paper, or scratched them on the walls with charcoal and broken bits of pottery. They could hear the rumble of guns as the relief force neared the city. But the faces that appeared at the windows were not those of British soldiers. The mutineers fired 2 volleys into the crowded rooms, but sickened by the slaughter, they refused to fire again. 4 butchers were recruited from the town. It was a little before sunset when they entered the Bibi Ghar. They emerged an hour later. At the sight of them, the remaining onlookers fled into the darkness. In the morning, a party of volunteers arrived to clear the bodies. They dragged them out of the building, stripped them of their blood-soaked clothing, and threw them down a nearby well. Eyewitnesses reported that several women and children were still alive, but they were thrown in along with the mutilated corpses.
I think the attacks on women can be explained in terms of a belief that the honor of a particular group was reposed in the women, and often when a group was conquered in war, women were attacked, raped, taken away into slavery, and so on. This was part of humiliating an enemy.
The streets of Kanpur were deserted as the relief force entered the city. Thousands had fled before them. Loyalists directed the advance guard to the Bibi Ghar. The first to open the door was a young officer of the 78th Highlanders. He reported that the scene he saw was the most awful that the eye could behold. He was wrong. A few moments later, he found the well. The news reached Britain a few weeks later.
When the details of the mutiny begin to appear in the British press in the summer of 1857, there is horror and outrage. Stories were coming back of the murder of European women and children, often in the most hideous circumstances. And the sort of respect which the Victorians had for women and for children, this was outraged.
Women at that time in Great Britain had been elevated to a ridiculous pedestal of sanctity and virtue, which made them on a different plane from men, and meant that the attack on them by people of another race was not only sexually wicked, but was actually religiously wicked too. And so the stories that came out of Cawnpore, for the women to be taken away into a small house and quite deliberately and obscenely slaughtered, affected the English public very, very greatly.
Victoria wrote to the wife of the Governor-General in Calcutta.
Our thoughts are almost solely occupied with India. My heart bleeds for the horrors that have been committed by people once so gentle on my poor countrywomen and innocent little children. It haunts me day and night.
The massacres at Cawnpore were not only the worst atrocity the British could imagine. They were regarded by the men who had conquered India as the most shameful reproach. They had failed their women and children. The darkness of the well at the Bibigar closed over them all.
Atrocities, well, that was actually war. And when you have war, there are bound to be some excesses. On both sides, yes. Well, it started off with a bunch of people, soldiers, who had a simmering resentment against the British who were lording it over them. So when they got the chance to get back at them, they were quite excessive. But thereafter, the retributions were quite terrible.
Thousands of British reinforcements poured into the affected area. Nana Sahib's palace was looted and leveled to the ground. But Nana Sahib and his followers had fled to the mountains, and with them, Azimullah Khan. They were hunted by the British for years, but never found. Instead, the British turned on other targets for their revenge. What had happened at Cawnpore became the justification for brutal reprisals.
We will have people like Dickens saying, we must retaliate with the fiercest measures. Well, they could save their breath. This was already happening in India. Clergymen are talking in terms of we need more massacres, more must be killed. And it reached such a point that some observers thought that the British people were suddenly revealing a deep-down savagery which everyone thought had disappeared.
Captured mutineers were taken to the Bibigar and made to lick the congealed blood from a patch of floor. Then they were strung up from the nearest tree. But the noose did not satisfy the army's thirst for revenge.
Any rebel whom they captured, they would either kill on the spot, or they would torture them, or ritually pollute them by forcing, say, Muslims to eat pork or Hindus to eat beef, after which they would hang them from a tree, from a scaffold, or blow them from guns. This they did by attaching their arms to the large wheels of the guns of those days and their body in front of the barrel of the gun and just blowing them to pieces.
Back in England, powerful voices were raised against the British descent into barbarity. At Windsor Castle, the Queen and Prince Albert sank into a deep gloom. The news from India seemed a mockery of Albert's hopes for the spread of civilized values through trade. At his urging, the Queen wrote to the Governor-General in India.
I should deeply deprecate any retribution on old men, women, and children, for then how could we expect any respect or esteem for us in the future?
As a mood of grief and shame descended on Britain, Victoria declared October 7th a national day of humiliation.
So that we and our people may humble ourselves before Almighty God in order to obtain pardon for our sins and send up prayers to the Divine Majesty for the restoration of tranquility.
But one thing would not be restored. The British government decided that a country the size of India could no longer be ruled by a private trading company. Prince Albert helped draft the royal proclamation that assumed direct rule by the British Crown. He insisted,
"The document should breathe feelings of generosity, benevolence, and religious toleration."
The Queen agreed. In the final version, she assured her Indian subjects,
The deep attachment which Her Majesty feels to her own religion, and the comfort and happiness which she derives from its consolations, will preclude her from any attempt to interfere with the native religions, and her servants will be directed to act scrupulously in accordance with her directions. May the proclamation be the beginning of a new era, and may it draw a veil over the sad and bloody past.
The Queen is suddenly, as it were, projected as India's new ruler, and she promises her people that she will take care of them in a motherly way. She will give them peace and justice and honest government. And the British accession of power, or total power in London, is a statement that there is a new beginning, and that those who wish to introduce change will do so more gingerly and carefully in future.
as a symbol of her trust in her new subjects. From then on almost every occasion she appeared in public, 2 Indian attendants would be at her side. But not the man who had been there since the early years of her reign, the man who had taught her how to rule an empire. In December 1861, Prince Albert fell ill at Windsor Castle. The Prime Minister was alarmed. The Queen was not.
The Prince has had a feverish cold these last few days, which disturbed his rest at night, but Her Majesty has seen His Royal Highness similarly affected before, and hopes that in a few days it will pass off.
But the Prince grew worse. The doctors suspected that he had fallen victim to a killer disease lurking in the drains of the medieval castle: typhoid. Victoria charted his decline in snatches of anguished prose.
In an agony of despair about my dearest Albert, and crying much for saw no improvement, and my dearest Albert was so listless and took so little notice.
She recorded the final scene in Albert's bedroom on December 14th, 1861.
I bent over him and said to him, "It is your little wife." I took his dear left hand, which was already cold, though the breathing was quite gentle, and I knelt down by him. 2 or 3 long but perfectly gentle breaths were drawn, the hand clasping mine, and all was over.
That single death in Windsor Castle was to change the course of Victoria's empire.
Learn more about Queen Victoria on PBS Online. Click on our interactive map to watch the expansion of the British Empire during Victoria's reign, or take a look behind the scenes and learn about the making of this Empire's special. It's all online at pbs.org.